DevilNeverCry.
Final Fantasy XVI is the latest title in the well-known series. Over the past week I've had the pleasure of putting 50 hours into this game, ultimately beating it. And so, in today's video, I'm going to be giving you my thoughts in the form of a review. I want to quickly preface this review by stating that it will be spoiler-free, both in the subjects that I talk about in regards to the narrative, and in the footage that you see in the background. Final Fantasy XVI is an action RPG, and is the latest entry in the acclaimed Final Fantasy series. As someone who grew up playing Final Fantasy games as a kid, with some of those games still ranking amongst my favourites to this very day, I know just how special these games can be as an experience, and so of course I was ecstatic when this game was announced. And after having graciously been invited by Square Enix to a few pre-release press events, allowing me to get hands-on with this game much earlier, my hype and expectations for this game reached an all-time crescendo. I think most of you that played the demo can share in that same feeling. The staging ground for the events of Final Fantasy XVI take place in the world of Valisthea, specifically on two continents known as the Twins. Within each of these two small landmasses harbours several different nations that are all going to war for various reasons. Some seemingly believe themselves to be on a holy crusade, others simply covet what others have. And it is within this land that we find ourselves in the shoes of our protagonist, Clive Rossfield, a noble who has a tragedy befall him and his family, ultimately leading him down a path of revenge. We follow Clive throughout multiple periods of his life as he sets out to right the wrongs of his past. However, just like Final Fantasies of the past and a lot of RPGs out there, this seemingly simple quest that drives Clive forward ultimately ends up being intertwined in a narrative and overarching plot that is far more grandiose and complex than you could possibly imagine. If there's one thing that I have to praise Final Fantasy XVI for, it's its narrative and the way it's presented to the player. This focus on a high fantasy world through a dark, brooding and brutal lens likened to the likes of Game of Thrones definitely plays to the strengths of the narrative and the themes that they attempt to convey in Final Fantasy XVI, with injustice and denying your own fate seemingly being a large focus. Every twist and turn of the story left me on the edge of my seat, pondering as to what might happen next. And with over 11 hours of cutscenes featuring the voices of many talented VAs that truly sell the emotional weight of the things they say, it was truly a pleasure to see this game's story unfold. And for those of you who have played a Final Fantasy game before, you'll ultimately realize that though this is a serious and more mature narrative, that it is Final Fantasy through and through, right to its very core. But as much as I like the cutscenes and the narrative, that of course isn't all that Final Fantasy XVI has to offer, so let's talk about the gameplay. The world of Valisthea is vast and large, however it is not open world. The game is split up into several large open zones that you're able to traverse at your own leisure, with a lot of these zones being interlinked. Throughout these open zones you're able to traverse on foot or via chocobo, provided you've done the side quest to unlock that of course, but we'll get to side quests later. And it is here that you're able to not only enter combat, but also complete side quests and go and hunt down specific notorious marks. Again, something we'll get onto much later. The second half of Final Fantasy XVI's gameplay pertains to stages, or as they're sometimes known as dungeons. These are areas of Valisthea that you're only able to enter and explore and fight your way through as a result of a specific story or narrative consequence that leads you there. They're often sequestered away and are not freely explorable. However, after completing and going through the entirety of one of these stages, you're able to replay it to your heart's content in case you've missed out any items or simply just want to experience the area once more. These different stages are visually distinctive, vary in size and length, often feature numerous different set pieces and intricate bosses, and ultimately have a very heavy combat approach to them. And ultimately, I think this approach of having numerous open zones and specific, tightly paced and designed stages play to the strengths of Final Fantasy XVI very well, largely because they don't tend to suffer from any of the issues that open world games tend to have. Issues such as being bloated with inconsequential points of interest that serve nothing to further the game or its narrative, or on the other end, having an open world that is absolutely devoid of things to do. As previously implied, at every point of Final Fantasy XVI, you'll have a main quest that you need to achieve to further the narrative ahead. However, at certain intervals, you'll have side quests open up, allowing you to do extracurricular activities to keep yourself preoccupied whenever you need to take a break from the main narrative. The side quests vary in scale and complexity, and in the rewards that they provide. Something that Final Fantasy XVI does that I appreciate is that if there are specific side quests that are worth doing purely because of their reward, For example, unlocking the ability to use chocobos in the open field areas. They'll signify this by putting a plus sign on the quest marker to let you know at a glance that hey, this is something that you definitely want to go and complete. The side quests overall are in line with what you'd expect from a standard RPG, albeit a lot of them do provide extra lore or context to the world of Valisthea to help you better understand the state of the world and ultimately the overarching narrative. A narrative, by the way, that you may at times find overwhelming simply due to how many moving parts there are in the machine, which is where the active time law system comes into play. During any cutscene in Final Fantasy XVI, if you find yourself pondering on what exactly is going on, who exactly are these characters you're seeing, or what exactly they're talking about, by pressing and holding down the trackpad, you'll have a lore system that pops up that will provide paragraphs of information for a few of the different things that you see on screen or things that are being talked about to allow you to understand what exactly is going on. This again on paper might seem like a system that is nothing to talk about, but is incredibly useful whenever you're playing the game, particularly if you've taken large breaks in between play sessions, or if you just want to reacquaint yourself with some much needed knowledge. The game goes to great lengths in numerous ways to ensure that you understand the narrative, going so far as to allow you to literally browse a lexicon or glossary that documents literally everything that you'd want to know about the world of Valisthea. Whilst exploration and completing side quests plays a large part of Final Fantasy XVI, we can't of course forget to talk about the game's combat, another part of the game that truly shines, especially compared to other action RPGs out there, such as the previous entry in the Final Fantasy series, Final Fantasy XV. Square Enix ended up hiring one of the combat directors from DevilNeverCry 5, and quite honestly, it truly shows, with Ryota Suzuki, the combat director himself, going so far to state that this game's combat system is something that he considers his own personal masterpiece. Whenever you're running through open fields or you're in one of the particular stages, you'll come across enemies pretty much everywhere that you go, and the player has complete freedom in how they approach these enemies and the combat encounters. The reasons that this game's combat system seemingly works so well is because of its focus on player engagement. The player is rewarded in numerous ways, from things like increased damage to reduced skill cooldown, by simply timing with precision specific attacks and dodges. This incentivizes the player to actually think about what they're doing as opposed to simply mashing the button. The game also allows the player to swap through multiple customizable skill sets in real time, allowing the player the freedom of expression in how they choose to take down their enemies. A lot of people like to compare this to DevilNeverCry, and whilst it shares certain strands of DNA with it, they are two different beasts entirely. Regardless, this is definitely one of the best action RPG combat systems that I've seen in a long time, and personally I think it ranks up there with some of the very best. Square Enix know just how well this combat system has been fine-tuned, allowing you to go through specific stages with an arcade mode where you are literally ranked on how well you fight against specific encounters, and for you action junkies out there who truly love a challenge, Square have included the Final Fantasy mode in this game. A hard mode where enemies are much tougher, their aggression is much higher, and the enemy encounters themselves have been entirely remixed to keep you on your toes. And if some of this sounds worryingly hard or you want to get to practicing right away, the game actually provides you with a training mode, a sequestered away room in which you're able to spawn in different enemies, allowing you to fight them to your heart's content, whether it's combo building or whether it's simply practicing the enemy's moveset for perfect parries. There's so much utility with this room, and I think it's something that again Square have definitely taken inspiration from the DevilNeverCry series. Of course, if you are looking for a challenge but you don't want to tackle Final Fantasy mode, there is the option of tackling Notorious Marks, aka hunts. There is a hunting board that you're able to frequent which will tell you that hunts are available, letting you know in which specific areas of the world that they can be found, or you can simply stumble upon them during your normal play. Notorious Marks often come in the form of unique, classic Final Fantasy enemies that prove quite a challenge. Not just because they're typically several levels higher than the enemy, but often because you wouldn't have seen them before at that point, meaning you're not quite accustomed to their attack patterns and what they are capable of doing. And again, this is where the strength of Final Fantasy XVI's combat comes into play. An enemy may be 15 levels above you and can defeat you in only a few hits, but provided that you are good enough a player to dodge everything that comes your way, through a war of attrition, you'll eventually defeat the enemy. Before I forget to mention, and quite honestly I'm surprised it's taken me this long to say, the soundtrack for Final Fantasy XVI is absolutely fantastic and truly heightens every single scene that it touches, whether it's combat, whether it's cutscenes, whether it's exploration. The game's composer, Masayoshi Soken, also worked on Final Fantasy XIV, so it's no surprise that the soundtrack here is nothing but stellar. It may seem like such an inconsequential thing to mention in a review, but a lot of the scenes in this game hit hard purely because they're supported by such a phenomenal soundtrack. And whilst we're here, it's also briefly worth talking about the visual fidelity. I played this game on performance mode, which meant the game targeted 1440p and 60 frames per second, and it held to that for the most part. This game is a beauty to look at, particularly on OLED displays. However, if there was one thing that I had to mention that does need improvement, I feel that it is the performance. For the most part, the performance was consistently strong. Very rarely did I ever encounter any large frame drops. However, I did notice that performance definitely took a hit, particularly in stages where there were set pieces going off in the background, or in specific cutscenes that were particle and effect heavy. These performance issues weren't anywhere near enough to ruin my experience with Final Fantasy XVI, and I do believe the team at Square Enix are aware of these performance issues and are working towards a potential patch to fix them, but it's just something to take into consideration. Ultimately, I believe that Final Fantasy XVI is a strong return to form for the Final Fantasy series, and quite honestly, it is my game of the year. From the narrative and its pacing, to the combat and its depth, to the visual fidelity, the sound design, the soundtrack, and the voice acting, this game fires on all cylinders, and it certainly doesn't miss. If you have a PlayStation 5, then I'd consider this game a must-play, and if you're still on the fence, definitely go ahead and check out the demo. If you find what you play impressive, you're actually able to transfer that save data over to the full game. With all that said and done, we finally come to the conclusion of this video. If you're looking for more Final Fantasy XVI content, do be sure to subscribe as there's plenty more on the way. And if you enjoyed today's video, do be sure to give it a like. Let me know down in the comments below if you plan on playing Final Fantasy XVI, and with all that said and done, it has been me, DevilNeverCry. I'd like to thank all of you for watching, and as always, I'll see you all next video.